Welcome to our Research Quest Live Q&A with our special guest. Today we are going to be chatting with Christina Young. Christina is a PhD candidate from the University of Texas, El Paso. She's fascinated by drylands, and we're going to be talking about that a lot today, and has done extensive work throughout the American Southwest. And we're very curious to discover what is on the desert soil surface and just underneath the surface. So in our class today, we have been talking about stability and change in ecosystems and how change over time can impact specific organisms, and then how that will impact other organisms because of all of these complicated relationships between the living things in an ecosystem. So Christina, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And, oh, I forgot to introduce myself, of course. I'm Tracy. I was teaching the class today, and we are also live on Facebook. So if you're just joining us to hear from our awesome guest, great. If you want to learn more about Research Quest Live, you can visit the museum's website. All right, let's jump in. I know you have some cool stuff to share with us. And so I wondered if maybe you could tell us a little bit just about yourself, and then maybe we could jump into looking at some of those cool photos.
Yeah, totally. Well, hi, everybody. Like Tracy said, my name's Christina, and what I study is deserts, or like we like to call them, dry lands. So kind of thinking about all the places where not a lot of water falls is kind of what a dryland means. And so I spend a lot of time studying them. And specifically what I'm most interested in studying and what I spend most of my time doing is looking at kind of that very top of the soil surface in these desert areas, and specifically here in Moab, Utah, where I live and do a lot of my work. And so maybe some of you are familiar with it. Maybe you know about it, Tracy. It's called biological soil crust that we have here in the desert, or BioCrust for short, if you want to get fancy. And the BioCrust that we have here in the desert is incredible and beautiful and really important for this desert ecosystem that we have. So I wanted to start off by showing you a picture. Can I show what that BioCrust looks like?
Yeah, let's look.
Awesome, let me show. So what you'll see in this picture here is kind of a landscape that we have down here in Moab. And I don't know how many of you out there have been to Moab, but it's amazing. If you haven't been, once it's safe to travel, you should come. And so this is right near my house. So I'm very lucky. And what we're looking at is the desert. And what you can see here, all these beautiful plants that we have. And down here in the desert, they're all crazy and weird and really adapted to living in this dry place. And then we have this trail you can see here. Can you see the mouse as I'm moving it, Tracy?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, cool. Just
and
checking.
Your image looks beautiful. So we can
awesome. So you can see, oops, don't click. So you can see this path here, and you can see the soil underneath. And then you see that there's all this kind of dark, bumpy stuff all around in between these plants. And that is what I'm talking about. That's the biological soil crust that we have here growing in the Utah desert and in deserts and drylands all over the world. And so if we were to zoom in, here's what that biocrust really looks like. And so it's a combination of all these different organisms, of lichens and mosses and cyanobacteria and algae and fungi that are living on the top few centimeters of the soil surface. And they're kind of creating this web and really kind of gluing the soil surface together, making it so that they're stable. That's one of the things that you guys are talking about. And also kind of being a buffer, resilient to changes, because they're keeping the soil together. They're able to hold water, and they're able to create nutrients. They're carbon and nitrogen fixers. And so they're adding these nutrients into the desert soil, which doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it because it's a lot of just sand. And so this biocrust is incredibly important. And they're super cool. And so that's what I spend most of my time doing, is studying these. And here we have some lichens, and mosses is the green, and a cacti, so you can kind of get a scale.
Now I have, just looking at this photo, I have so many questions, but
let's start.
I'll start with one of them. In our class, we've been talking about producers, and that plants are producers in a system, and then there are consumers and decomposers. And my understanding is that biological soil crust is a community of many living things. And so what kinds of roles does the biocrust play in that system? You know, are they producers? Are they consumers? Are they decomposers? Or maybe they're all of them?
I would say they're all three. They're a whole ecosystem unto themselves. And so one of the things that people don't maybe realize about deserts is that in just like all ecosystems, you have kind of primary producers, which are the plants. But in deserts, you have, because the plants have to grow so far apart because there's just not a lot of water. So you have all this area, this ground in between the plants, and that's filled with biocrust. And because there's so much of it, even though they're not big and tall like plants, because there's so much of it, they're actually primary producers. And they're primary producers, they can photosynthesize, if you were to like take the area, almost as much as plants.
Wow.
So that's like pretty incredible that these tiny microorganisms that you can only really see their bodies under a microscope are really a primary producer in drylands. And then they have fungi in them that are decomposing. They have all of the different processes going on because it's a grouping, it's a community of all these different organisms that are living together. And so it makes these places in this dryland ecosystems unique and really cool to think about and to study.
Well, that is super cool to think about. What is the energy as producers that the soil crust is taking in? It's really cool. One thing I also noticed that was really interesting about the photo with the trail, you know, and I've been lucky enough to be able to visit some of these places in Utah, and I was just thinking about when I had visited, for example, the Dead Horse Point Visitor Center and walked around, and it looked very different from that photo that you just showed because, you know, seeing the color of that dry, dusty soil that you could see on the trail is what you kind of see everywhere as you're walking around there. So I thought maybe you could kind of talk about that and the dark areas, because if you've never been to these places, it kind of is hard to tell the difference.
Yeah, well, you know, that's a really good observation. And, you know, if you think about it, where you were is probably a place where a lot of people visit. And so that dead horse area is very popular because it's just so beautiful. And, you know, a lot of people go there and a lot of people walk there. And so the thing about biocrusts, these organisms, is they're really strong because they can, you know, they're kind of woven together. So they're like a strong covering over the soil surface. But the way that they're not strong is they're not strong when they get disturbed from the top. So like a footstep or you know, a hoof print or a tire track. When they get pressure from the top, they break apart really easily. And so what ends up happening is places where a lot of people go, or where there's a lot of cattle grazing, or when there's, you know, other things that we do on the landscape, which are important. I love going to Dead Horse. But what it does is it can break up the crust. And so that's why you saw in that picture, I can show it again. That's why you see in that picture that there's this really clear color difference. In this trail. So here's this trail, and that's what a lot of the areas around Dead Horse are going to look like, where a lot of people are walking. And then here, this dark crust. What that means is that not a lot of people go up here, right? They don't, or at least when they go up here, they stay on very, very strictly on the trail. They don't walk off trail. And so what this black covering actually is, this actual color, is it is sunscreens. That the cyanobacteria, which are, you know, the main primary producers in biocrusts, they create these sunscreens for themselves to protect their bodies from the hot, bright, intense sun UV. And they create these pigments that are dark in color so that they can protect their fragile chloroplasts where they make their sugars from sunlight. And so that's why they're this dark color. But in order to be able to have this crust that's this dark color, you need the crust to have not been disturbed for a long time. So I'm going through a lot here, so stop me if it's a little much, but
no, this is so great. Yeah.
Okay, good.
You know, when I have visited places, I feel like it rarely looks like that.
Yeah, well, so
but maybe
totally
that's
right.
because I mostly go to places where people are allowed to go.
Well, people are allowed to go, and something to think about in these deserts is, you know, in the last 100 years, they've seen a lot of use. You know, a lot of cattle have been in this area for a long time. And these biocrests, in order to get to that dark, bumpy, really cool looking form, it takes a long time. And so just like if you were to go into a rainforest or a redwood tree forest and cut down all the trees, right? Maybe you guys have talked about succession. So there's this slow process where first some plants will come back, and then, some other slower growing plants will come and outcompete those plants. And then over time, eventually you're going to get those redwoods back, but it's going to take a long time. And so with those dark crusts that you saw in that picture, you can think of those as the old growth redwoods, or the old growth rainforest of the desert. It takes a long time to get them back, and the area needs to not be disturbed for a really long time. So you can totally find those places. You just have to get farther away from where people like to go. And also when you get there, you have to recognize how special it is and do your best not to step off trail.
I loved that explanation you just provided. That was so helpful. And in our investigation today, actually looking at the Uinta Mountains and the loss of the lodgepole pines, that's something that our scientist, Dr. Mitch Power, was talking about, because he said, right now we see there's just this vast areas where there's a lot of dead pine trees, and it's likely that other tree species like aspen are going to come in, but it can take 80 years or longer. Like it takes a long time for that sort of disturbance to, have, the players in the system to change, right? It takes a very long time.
Totally.
As you were talking, I had another question about, how can you tell, or can you tell how old soil crust is when you look at it? I've heard many kids say this is thousands or millions of years old. So, is that something that we can tell?
It's a great question. And I get kind of a similar type question, like how long does it take to come back after it has been disturbed? We can't look at something and we can't look at these crusts and say how old they are. These microorganisms are turning over all the time. But one thing that you can look at is, so here on the Colorado Plateau in Moab, where I am, it's a cold desert, so it freezes in the winter time. And when the soil freezes, it can do this thing called frost heaving. So, when there's some moisture, and then the moisture freezes, it kind of does this cool pattern because of physics, where it kind of heaves up the soil. And that's why, if you've seen this crust, it actually can be these kind of pinnacles. They can be kind of tall. The crust is kind of heaving up together. And so the more winters that it has had time to frost heave, the taller it is. So that means the older it is. So you can kind of get an idea. And also, like I said, with this late successional idea that the more colors, the more lichens, the more mosses, the more dark pigment in these crusts, the older they are. As far as like actual age numbers, it's very difficult. So just like anything else that's, growing outside, if it's growing in a nice, wet, shaded place, it's going to grow faster than if it's in this really hot, exposed area, just like your tomato plants or any other plants out there. And so biocrust that has been disturbed and then is kind of growing back, it's going to grow back faster if it's on a shaded area as opposed to a more exposed area, or if it's in an area that is maybe closer to a water source or gets more water in that part of the desert than another part. And so it's hard to give you exact ages, but as far as how long it takes to come back after a disturbance, it also depends on the type of disturbance. So if you were to step on it once and then not step on it again, it's probably going to come back. And depending on how much moisture there is, 1 to 2 years. If you've rolled over it with a tank, it's going to be a much bigger type of disturbance. So it could take decades for that crust to come back and look bumpy and look the cool ways we like the crust to look. So it's kind of a complicated answer for a simple question, but it's, just like anywhere else, these ecosystems are complex, but so cool.
So complex. One thing that I think that kids have wondered as they've learned about this is, it's not something that maybe they've seen before or that feels familiar. I mean, certainly I didn't, before visiting Southern Utah, I had never really thought about biological soil crust. So is that something that is unique to just that place, or can that be found other places as well?
A fantastic question. Biocrusts can be found all over the world. They can be found everywhere. There's some in Antarctica. There's biocrust in every desert. You can find a biocrust in the alpine, so up above tree line. Really, the thing about biocrust is it would be basically the whole world would be covered in biocrust if it weren't for plants, right? So the only limiting thing that's stopping biocrust is that they get outcompeted for space and light by plants. Before vascular plants evolved, it was a biocrust world. They were microorganisms on most land surfaces. So they're kind of like the OG of our planet. And so, yeah, you can find them everywhere. And once you start to notice them, you'll start to, like, once you know about them, you'll start to see them in a lot of places. And so like a cut in a, you're on a trail and it's even in a forest and there's like kind of a cut and there's soil exposed, you might get mosses. Those are kind of like a biocrust, growing along. Really, a biocrust is just anything that's kind of holding the soil surface together. So keep an eye out, and anytime you see, something kind of holding down the soil surface that's not a plant, you could be like, well, maybe that's a biocrust. Cool, like you saw one.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And in that first photo you showed, you really don't see trees. So that's something, if you have not visited this area, you might not be familiar with that, but you don't see many trees in the landscape there. So that's kind of interesting. So the biocrust though, and plants are definitely competing, because that is something that we have been talking about in our investigations, is how the producers are competing with each other.
It's a really interesting question, and it's a complicated question, just like it always tends to be. They're competing for space, sort of, but they also might be facilitating each other too. So working together. We don't really have a clear answer. I think sometimes it is more like a competition. They're competing for space, mostly sunlight, and they're competing for water. Plants are so much bigger that they kind of have the upper hand there. Like if they wanted to, if they could, they'd cover biocrust pretty easily. But plants are limited because we just don't have a lot of water here. And so that's the reason we don't have a lot of trees, is we just don't have enough precipitation to support that kind of large biomass plant growth. But biocrusts they can produce nitrogen, and so they can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix nitrogen in their bodies and make it available to the soil and to plants. And there, in our desert, at least here, there aren't a lot of other nitrogen fixing species. And so nitrogen, right? We need nitrogen, so do plants. Everybody needs nitrogen to grow. And so biocrusts maybe providing the nitrogen that plants need. And so there's some hypotheses out there that actually, the nitrogen made by biocrust is the main form of nitrogen that plants are using. So in that case, plants would be like, we love you, biocrust, no competition there, like come hang out with us, So it's kind of a complicated question with all of these different interactions going on, but it's not all competition out here. You gotta, when you're so limited by rainfall and water availability, there's sometimes some evolutionary pressure to kind of work together.
Very cool. Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that, because that's a lot of what we've been talking about today. And in fact, tomorrow we're going to be talking about as well with sort of limiting factors with some of the organisms that we're looking at in the Uintas. Let's shift gears just a little bit. I would love to hear a little bit more about your research and some of your projects that you're working on, because I know that you have a podcast, and I think it'd be cool to highlight some of the stuff that you're working on right now.
I'd love to talk about my research. Actually, what I end up looking a lot at is this relationship between biocrusts and plants. I'm very interested in how they are related and what's going on, and who really out there is making these deserts livable, because it's a hard place for these plants to make a living. And so a lot of what I look at is trying to figure out how the nutrients that, that, like I said, all of us and the plants need and the biocrusts need, how that nutrients that's being made in the biocrusts, where that nutrients is going, where the nutrients made there are going. And so is it being moved into the deeper soil? Are plants like taking it and using it? what different organisms are involved. Are fungi, like maybe you guys have talked about kind of the fungi that transport nutrients in between trees and in wooded places. Well, is there a similar network of fungi that are transporting nutrients in the desert? These are all questions that we really don't have the answer to. And so a lot of that is what I look at for my PhD research. And then I'm also really interested in trying to figure out how we can restore these biocrusts. So like I mentioned, they are getting, in a lot of areas, they've been disturbed and it takes a long time for them to come back. And so, you know, as scientists, we're like, I wonder if we can help by figuring out ways, doing research projects to figure out what conditions we could put out biocrusts back onto the landscape and have it grow. And so what I was doing a lot for my master's work was I actually was growing biocrust in a greenhouse. So we'd go out to the field and we collect biocrust, not too much, so we didn't disturb too much, but we took some and we brought it back to the greenhouse and we grew it in these containers in the greenhouse. And then we saw, you know, we grew it so that there was a lot more than we originally collected. And then we brought it back out into the field and said, can we put it back and have it grow? And can we do these other things like give it extra nutrients or give it some water or stabilize the soil around it to see if we can get these biocrusts to take back into the soil so that they can provide their ecosystem services. And so that's a lot of the research that I've been interested in. Because just like, you know, talking about change, talking about stability, when we lose these organisms, it causes a lot of change. And so putting them back is really important. And so far it's been hard. Those are dry places where it's hard to get things to grow. It's hard to get plants to grow. It's also hard to get biocrusts to grow. So we have a lot of research. So anybody out there who is considering getting into science, think about biocrust restoration as the future of something that needs a lot of great minds and a lot of interested people to think about, because it's a big problem. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but drylands cover almost 43% of the Earth's, you know, land surface. And so there's a lot of areas that need restoration, and biocrust restoration is a big part of that.
That's so great. Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I often feel that young people think that, you know, science is done, scientists have already done everything, you know, everything's been studied. And so, you know, I'd love to hear, you know, what is the history of even looking at biocrusts? Is that something that's been studied for a long time?
Not at all. It's such a new field. It's so exciting to be a part of because we just don't know a lot about it. And so it's really only been since like the 80s that people have been like, wait, what are these weird things on the soil surface? And there was just a few people who were looking at them. One of the pioneers of biocrust science lives right here in Moab, Utah. And her name is Jane Belknap. And she was one of the original people who was like, these things are cool. What are they doing out here? And then she her and some early colleagues kind of developed this whole field of biocrust research. And now biocrust research is happening all over the world. So China, Israel, Australia, Spain, Mexico, Germany, there's all these places where there's these big labs that are doing biocrust research, and it's so cool. And there's just so many more questions than answers. And that's true about deserts in general. Like people haven't studied deserts as much as some of the other systems, you know, for a variety of reasons. But whenever I stand out in the desert, I look around and I can think of easily 10 questions that don't have any answers, and at least not in Western science. And so it's a field that is just so interesting, has so much room for exploration. It's very cool.
That is just so fascinating. It was interesting. Yesterday, we had a chance to chat, I already mentioned this, with Bryn Dentinger, who is the mycology scientist at the museum, and, you know, very similar, just the study of mushrooms. I mean, I can't even quantify how many new species are being discovered all the time, because it's something that people have not extensively looked at. And you know, I'm curious, is there like a biocrust society the way there is a mycology society?
You know, actually, there's talk of starting one. So one is in the works. We now are in our 4th year of our of our BioCrest conference. So we have a conference every other year where all the BioCrest scientists get together. Last year it was in Australia and it was awesome. And, you know, like up to 200 different people come from all over the world and spend a week talking about BioCrest. And we're trying to form a society, and we're starting to kind of organize and do these similar experiments all over the world so we can try to say some big picture things about what BioCrests are doing in different places. And also there, you know, speaking of mycology, you know, there are mushrooms that are part of this. They're fungi and specifically mushrooms that come out of this crust that we just don't know anything about. So if you're into mycology, come study it in deserts. It's a whole new world of weird down here.
That's so awesome. Okay, well, we still have 5 minutes, so we have a little bit of time. And I wanted to make sure to share about your podcast. Is that something you're still actively working on, or is it something you look up?
We have an organization down here actually that's called Science Moab, and you can learn more about it at sciencemoab.org. And it has a podcast, and the podcast is interviews with other scientists. And so it's about all different science that's going on down here in Southeast Utah. So it includes ecology, things like I'm talking about, but also paleontology and archaeology and stuff about the night sky and all sorts of really different cool topics about all of the science. Because what people don't always know is down here in Southeast Utah, we have like an incredible amount of science happening. You know, we don't have a university here, but we have a lot of people who live here and do science, and then a lot of people who come here because there's just so much cool stuff to learn from this landscape and all the public lands that are here down in Southeast Utah. And so on our podcast, Science Moab, which is on all the podcast places, we just talk to all these people who are doing really cool work. And we always love when people listen and tell us what they think.
That is so cool to think that there's this scientist community, but they're all working in different areas, I'm sure. And it's probably a cool place to come up with lots of new ideas with different scientists working together. So that's very, very cool. I know many people here in Utah, certainly they think of Moab as this place for recreation. You know, that's why we go to Moab, for recreation and different outdoor activities. But it's so exciting to hear there's all this amazing scientific research that's happening there. So
yeah, when you think of Moab, don't just think of mountain biking, also think of science.
Very cool. Well, that would be, I think, so fun for kids and young people to check out, as well as anybody really, but the Science Moab podcast sounds really cool. So we'll have to check that out.
Thanks.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left. And maybe we could just quickly ask about sort of where you're going in your research and some questions that you have that you're thinking about exploring in the future.
Oh, it's a great question. Right now, what I'm working on and what I'm most excited about is, like I said, a lot of different scientists around the world are trying to restore biocrests in places where they've been lost because we see how important they are. They also create resiliency in ecosystems. I'm not sure if you're talking about that with change, but you know, when you want things to be a little bit buffered against big scale changes like climate change or land use disturbance. And so biocrests can be this buffering to help it so that ecosystems don't just change really dramatically all at once, especially desert systems. And so, so scientists are trying to restore biocrests. And what I'm doing is I'm actually taking all the published papers, right? So all these experiments, they get put into published papers and they get put into journals. And so I'm taking the data from all of those different papers all around the world, and I'm putting them all together in this one big database. And I'm asking, where is biocrest restoration successful and why? And so hopefully by taking all of this cool data from all around the world, we can start saying some big picture things to help us understand how to all move forward and better restore biocrests to create kind of more resilient ecosystems to kind of that can withstand the changes that we're definitely going to be seeing here in the desert as the climate continues to warm.
Yeah, that's sounds very, very important. And I'm very impressed by the work that you're doing. And we sort of touch on that a little bit in our Research Quest classes. And so today, we were talking about what does the future hold for the Uinta Mountains and how might things look different in the future. And yeah, thinking about these changes and what's going to happen next. Well, thank you again for joining us today. We're sort of in our last week of Q&A with special guests and scientists. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us virtually. And if you have further questions for Christina, you can always share those with the Ask a Question button or, you know, on our Facebook that we're streaming on, and we'll make sure they get passed on to Christina. And so thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you tomorrow for our next class. We're going to be having class again at 9:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, Mountain Daylight Time. And so we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. All right, bye.
Thanks, bye.